A lot of people ask, how did the war between Ukraine and Russia start in 2022? They ask to know the causes and the reasons and why did it start? And see, right there in the question, there are two mistakes. Why did the war between Russia and Ukraine start in 2022? Two mistakes. The first one is the year, because the war didn't start in 2022. It started in 2013. In 2013, there was a coup d'etat in Ukraine. And it was called, after the fact, the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan Revolution, the Freedom Revolution. But it wasn't a revolution, it was a coup d'etat, it was a color revolution. And what a color revolution is very simply, you see, a legitimate grievance arises among the people. And they protest, like people usually do. And in such situations, normally, the leadership will react and adjust and change to, quiet down the masses, as they usually do in all of human history. But see, a color revolution is basically when American money and European money in NGOs bring out agents provocateurs, basically thugs, to infiltrate the crowd of peaceful protesters. And these thugs ramp up the violence. They ramp up the violence to an extreme. And so, of course, the police, in the face of this violence, they have to use violence of their own to shut it down. And, of course, innocent people die in such a situation. And those innocent people are then raised up as the victims, the martyrs of the evil regime. And the agents provocateur, they egg on the people to go into the government buildings and smash open the buildings and invade the buildings, because they keep saying, we, the people, it's a democracy, these are our buildings, the buildings of the people. And so the mob goes into the government buildings and takes it over. The thugs take it over. See? That's how color revolutions work. And if you're thinking January 6th, very good. High marks, a little gold star on your forehead. So anyway, in 2013 and 14, this color revolution happened. And the people who took over were basically puppets of the Americans. The Americans picked the government that was going to be put in place after this revolution, which was really a coup d'etat. And following this revolution, i.e. coup d'etat, engineered by the Americans and the American NGOs that were in Ukraine paying for these thugs, well, what happened was that Russia became extremely alarmed, and all of a sudden there was a war between Ukraine and Russia in the Donbass area, the southeast area of Ukraine, because those people in the southeast, they wanted no part of this new government, because this new government was ultra-nationalist, which sounds all good and fine, until you realize that Ukraine is essentially a country divided between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians. And the ethnic Ukrainians and the extreme nationalists that were put into power following the Maidan revolution, the Maidan coup of 2013 and 14, well, those people hated the ethnic Russians, and the ethnic Russians were concentrated in the Donbass area. And so they started to go in there trying to pacify this area that wanted no part of their nonsense. And of course, all of a sudden, shooting starts, shelling starts, fighting starts, and the Russians in Russia, wanting to defend the people in the Donbass, because it really was a genocide. The neo-Nazis who went down to the Donbass to pacify the area were real neo-Nazi, Azov crazy people. Well, the Russians and the Ukrainian armies started clashing in the Donbass. That's essentially what happened. I'm simplifying it grossly, but for the sake of this short video, it's enough for you to understand. And in 2015, there was an agreement made, a ceasefire agreement called the Minsk Agreements. And these agreements were brokered by Germany and France. And this agreement was a roadmap to peace in the Donbass. But the new regime in Ukraine refused to accept it. I mean, they signed it because their arm was basically twisted for reasons that are complicated, and so just take my word for it. But they signed it, but they never lived up to it. And for the next 8 years, they kept shelling the Donbass, kept attacking it. That's why now there are all these fortifications. Why do you think they built them over 8 years? Because those fortifications were to defend against the war that the Ukrainians were constantly fomenting. They were constantly shelling Lugansk and Donetsk, those two cities, and also the entire regions. 16,000 people died in the 8 years. So the war did not start in 2022. The war just came to a crescendo in 2022. And in fact, there is reputable intelligence at this time that indicates that the Ukrainian army was gathering in southeast Ukraine because they were getting ready for a blitzkrieg attack on Lugansk and Donetsk in order to take them over, finally, and end this perpetual conflict. And the proof of this is the fact that there are roughly 100,000 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, right there, right now, being encircled by the Russian army. Because what happened in February 24th, essentially, the Russians beat them to the punch. There was going to be an open war in the Donbass regardless. The Ukrainians were going to attack and try to capture and conquer and pacify the Donbass region. And the Russian army just beat them to it, and now here we are. But there are two mistakes that you made in your question. Why did this war between Russia and Ukraine start in 2022? As I explained, it started in 2014. But it's not a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's between Russia and the United States by way of NATO. Because NATO, what is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? It is an American alliance. America is the big dog of the alliance, and it's got all these little chihuahuas around it. You know, France, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, all these little chihuahuas, and the US, the big dog, with all the big weapons. And NATO, of course, is this big money-making machine because in order to be a part of the NATO alliance, you have to buy American weapons. You have to pay in dollars for these American weapons, okay? I mean, you got to understand that NATO is a big old financial scam, but apart from that, you see, the reason to overthrow the Yanukovych regime in 2014, which is what happened, the president Yanukovych was overthrown, and he was not really pro-Russian. He was basically trying to play both sides off the middle, you know, like all politicians do. But anyway, he was overthrown because what NATO, i.e. the United States, wanted to do was to install in Ukraine a pro-America regime, which they did. The Poroshenko regime followed by the Zelensky regime. And these regimes were all puppets. Do you know that a lot of the ministers, the cabinet members of the Ukrainian government after 2014 were in fact American citizens? They were all appointed by the American State Department. Yeah, if not appointed, they were approved by the American State Department. And like I said, some of these cabinet members were actually American citizens until 2 days before their appointment. I'm not kidding. One of them was Georgia, you know. He was brought in from Georgia because he's, you know, pro-Western. He's one of our guys, you see? And so this is really not Ukraine versus Russia. This is NATO, i.e. the United States, versus Russia. Because the Americans, you know, they're too chicken shit to just go up and do the job themselves and fight themselves. No, they use the Ukrainian proxies. See? That's what's been going on here. NATO, the US, they've been at war with Russia, and that war started in 2007. It started in February of 2007 when Vladimir Putin gave a very, very famous speech called the Munich speech. It was this big powwow of all these international leaders. And they were going to be talking about, you know, the future and globalism and blah, 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 you know, the usual garbage, right? And the thing is, see, up to this time, up to 2007, Vladimir Putin was considered our guy in Russia. He was considered a man we can work with in Russia. And the thing is, he had been installed in 1999 with the support of the West. Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, the president at the time, you know, besotted alcoholic that he was, he had been convinced to put Putin. And Putin had taken the job, a former KGB agent, considered very cautious, very reliable, a man who follows orders. And the thing is, see, everything was working hunky-dory insofar as Vladimir Putin running Russia. I mean, you look at the New York Times from those years, and there were articles praising him and how what a great leader he was and all this nonsense, right? But in 2007, he gave this speech in Munich. And in this speech, he basically said that the age of the unipower, the United States, was coming to an end. And the problem with the unipower is that the unipower, and he said it, ballsy, right to their face, he said that the unipower resorted to hyper-violence whenever it didn't get its way. You know, this landed like a ton of bricks on these people, okay? Because there were all kinds of leaders there, okay? And they were all looking. All the European leaders were there. They were like kind of horrified. And you look at the video, it's kind of funny because they did not expect this speech at all. It's a long speech and it's worth reading. It's one of the most important speeches of this century because it's in essence a declaration of war. Because Vladimir Putin is basically saying, we don't want to live in a unipolar world where all power is concentrated in Washington. We don't want to live in a place where it's basically a dictatorship, a pyramid, where everything is in Washington and everybody is subordinated to Washington. We want to live in a multipolar world where it is inevitable that there are going to be concentrations of power, but they're going to be distributed around the world. And what we want is global security, indivisible security, where all of us feel confident and free and secure so that we can pursue our lives. We can trade, we can build houses, we can build families, we can do everything that we all each want to do with our lives. But it should be done in a multipolar regime, a multipolar system, not a unipolar system. The United States should not be the dictator of the world. That's what he said. And the West correctly, the Americans very correctly, interpreted that speech as a declaration of war. And the war started slowly. I mean, in 2007 and 2008, we had the global financial crisis, which hit Russia, hit everybody. I mean, it was a big disaster. And so the war kind of like didn't happen, even though there were things going on in Syria and all the rest of it, right? But then in 2013, 2014, with Ukraine, that's when it was clear. That's when everyone knew the war is on. And it's not Ukraine, Russia. That's just a proxy. Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian nation will be thrown as a sacrifice in this war because it's a proxy war that's going on. Ukraine, they are facing the brunt of this battle. But it's really a war between the United States and Russia. You have to understand this. If you don't understand this, you're not going to understand the whole picture. You're not going to understand how everything is connected because in this war, well, this war is global. Everybody's so worried that, World War III might start anytime soon. Brother, you're in it. This is the Third World War. This is it. And this that's going on here in Ukraine, in Kharkov, which I can hear, right outside my window, I am telling you, man, this is just the first battlefield. But this war is going on around the world, socially, culturally, economically, politically, militarily. It's going on all fronts, and it's all connected. And once you start to realize it, then you start to see the connections. Then you start to see what's really going on. Understand. The war between Ukraine and Russia did not start in 2022. The war between America and the rest of the world started in 2007.